with French seams, band, and trim. First thing you gotta do is cut it out. You got the main part of the pillowcase, 42 inches by 26 inches. The 42 inches is basically how wide your fabric is, so you don't really have to cut that one, you just have to cut the 26-inch length of the fabric. So right here I have the 26-inch length of the fabric. I also have the band, which is 9 inches, and the trim, which is 1.5 inches, all the whole width of the fabric. So 3 pieces for this pillowcase. First thing I did was iron everything flat. Iron all the wrinkles out. Then I pick out my thread. This is the closest green I've got. And if you lay out the thread, it blends into the fabric nicely so you can barely see it. So that's what I'm gonna use. So our directions say prep work. We're gonna take the trim piece, this skinny one, we're gonna press it in half lengthwise, wrong sides together, and set it aside. The band, this piece, we're going to press it in half lengthwise, wrong sides together, and then press one of the long edges down by 1/2 inch. Set it aside. This one in half, it's folded in half, and we did this one in half with the 1/2 inch turn back, so those are all ready. So now what we're going to do, main pillow part, on the right side of the main pillow part, we're going to lay the trim, this piece, along one long edge, matching up the raw edges. So I'm going to unfold this piece, and this is the raw edge side, not the folded side. I'm gonna match it up with this raw edge, and I'm gonna match up at the top and the bottom. So I'm gonna sew those, pin and sew all the way across the width of fabric. All right, it's pinned in place. The directions say to baste. Remember, that's a long stitch length, so I'm going to put my stitch length at 4. I'm going to baste the trim, the yellow piece, to the main piece along this raw edge using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Whenever I baste, it's temporary stitching. The real seam allowance here is going to be 1/2 inch, so it's going to be more up here. So I want my basting stitch to be hidden, so I want it to be smaller than my actual seam allowance is going to end up being. And it's okay if your pieces don't quite match up. We'll just trim them to match up later. Now for this pillowcase, we're going to do French seams along the seams. So the directions say fold the main pillow part in half, wrong sides together, not right sides together, for French seams. For French seams, we need wrong sides together. We're going to pin the side and the end that does not have the trim sewn on, okay? So we're going to pin together this side and this end. So on this side, You are going to want to match up the tops of these trim pieces as much as possible. Get them lined up. You don't want them to be not matched up. You see that? So match those up as closely as you can and pin. And this fabric still has the selvage edge on it, so I'm gonna sew a 1/4 inch past the selvage edge. I'm gonna end up cutting off the white part. So I'm gonna use that white part as my guide. I'm gonna sew a 1/4 inch in. And then when I get down to this end, I'm just gonna sew a 1/4 inch in from the raw edge, okay? Now I stop a 1/4 inch away from the end, pick up my foot, pivot, and keep going. All right, we sewed along the one side and the end without the trim with the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to trim, meaning to cut the seam allowance to 1/8 of an inch. So this whole seam that we just sewed at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, we're basically going to cut it in half. And then we're going to press the seam allowance to one side, then turn the pillow to be wrong sides out, and press again along those seams, okay? It doesn't matter which way you press it, just one way or the other. And then this short end down here is going to be a little hard, but just do it as best you can. Don't burn yourself. Good. All right, now we're going to turn it right sides together. If you need help getting the corner out, you can use a little pin. There we go. So this is the seam. We're going to press along the edges that we sewed. And we want this seam to be right along the edge. I don't want to see it on this side, and it shouldn't show on the other side either. It needs to be right on the edge. Continue the French seam, we're going to sew again along the side and the end without the trim using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This way all the raw edges should be enclosed along those two sides. So along this side that we just pressed, we're going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. inside out and press well. And when we turn it right side out, we get to check and see how well we matched up our our trim. Awesome. Because of the French seam on the inside, it's going to be real hard to get a real sharp corner, but this is a pillowcase, that's good enough. And again, we want to put the seam line right on the edge. Alright, so here's our French seam. We pressed it. Everything looks nice. Our trim is lined up nicely across the seam. I just wanted to show you one thing real fast. If you don't trim after the first step enough, or your seam on the second step is too narrow, when you turn it right side out, you're gonna see the raw edges in there. If that happens to you when you turn it right side out, all you have to do, you don't have to take that out. All you do is you go back and just take a little bit bigger seam allowance right there, and then it will be enclosed and the raw edges will be gone. All right, so now we are going to work on the band. We're going to unfold all the pressed edges of the band and sew the two short ends together with 1/2 inch seam allowance, like that, and then we'll press seam allowances open. So you will need to double check this piece because you are going to match up the band with the main body. So match up these sides and bring it over here and just see where you need to sew. I'm going to put a pin in where I need that seam allowance to be. Right there. So you mark it where you need to sew, which is a little bit more than 1/2 inch in, but you want this band to end up being able to match up with your main body. I'm gonna cut this seam allowance down. It's quite wide, so I'm gonna cut it down to about 1/2 inch, and then I'll press that seam allowance open. I'll press the seam allowance open, and then I will press those folds back in place. Great. Now we're going to pin the band into place. Pin the unpressed edge of the band to the main pillow edge. Right sides are going to be together and all raw edges even. To be honest, you could sew it to the right side or to the wrong side of the main pillow. The band can be put on either way. It's kind of a matter of preference, but I'm going to show you the way in the directions. All right, so I'm going to match up my seam allowances first. So the seam allowance of the band and the seam allowance of the main body. I'm going to peek inside, make sure those seams match up perfectly. The band seam allowance is pressed open, and the seam allowance on the inside is going to be to the side. And then I'm going to pull it to the other side, using this to kind of help me keep it straight. Here we go. I'll pin this other side. And we'll pin a couple places along the center here. Now we're going to sew this together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. As you notice, I'm getting a little puckering right before the pin, which probably means my band is a little bit too long to match up with the main pillow. But as I sew, I'm going to be pulling the top to match, or I'll be pulling the bottom to match up with the top. And hopefully it'll work out at the end and I won't get a little pucker. But let's see how it works out. I'm going to pull now. I'm going to stretch the fabric. Made it. Perfect. Alright, we just sewed the band to the main pillow using 1/2 inch seam allowance. This should leave a 1/4 inch of the trim visible. Let's see. 1/4 inch of the trim is still visible. Press the band away from the main pillow. So the direction said to press the seam allowance away from the main pillow, so towards the band. You want to press it towards the band. And the trim is going to go towards the main pillow. Now what we're going to do with the band is, now we get to use these folds that we put into place before. So this fold is going to come up here and meet up with this seam line. We're going to fold it along this 1/2 fold, and then this fold is going to match up, cover up that seam line. And I'm going to put some pins into place to hold that. This seam line is going to match up with the seam line here. Now we pin carefully into place. Now we're going to top stitch on the band on the right side, an 1/8 inch away from the seam line through all the layers. Now the way I pinned this is a little tricky. I pinned on the inside. I'm going to be sewing along the outside right here, but I have the pin heads pointing to the outside, so hopefully I'll be able to get my hand in to slip them out before I sew over the pin. Sewing over the pin can break the pin, can break your needle. It can just bend, and that's like okay, except that it's bent and you have to throw it away. Or it could like totally break in half and fly everywhere, and it might hurt you or anybody standing nearby you. So I'm going to start here, back stitch a little, and go. So now you can come inside and check and make sure you caught all the places you were going to catch. I missed it here. Let's see if there's anywhere else. Alright, so that's the only spot right here. So I put a pin in on this side, and put a pin in on this side. Let's look and see what we got here. So I have two choices. I can either just sew from here to here with a little bit further on this side to catch that underneath. I can just come in here and just hand sew this little bit so it's secure, or I can clip here in the center, remove the stitching to here, tie a knot, remove the stitching to here, tie a knot, and then redo it. And that's what I think I'm gonna do. All right, the pillowcase is finished. I'm just gonna give one last press around the band. Make sure everything's lying nice and flat. And we're done. With the second pillowcase and band, I'm going to show you the other way to put the band on. So the other way to put the band on, you are going to put the same raw edges, unpressed raw edge. It's going to match up with the raw edge with the trim piece, but you're going to put the right side of the band to the wrong side of the main pillow. See that? Right side of the band to the wrong side of the main pillow. We're still going to match up all of our seams. So I sewed the band on to the main pillow, and I found it was easiest to sew on this side with the needle on this side, and then I can make sure it's an even distance from the edge of the trim. That way the trim will be even and not all wobbly. So now we are going to pull the band away from the main pillow, and we're going to press the seam allowance this way. So the trim is going to point towards the main pillow, and the seam allowance is going to be back towards the main pillow. All right, so here we are. Now with the band, we're going to again match up our seam with the seam here on the pillow, and we're going to just cover the stitching with the band. We're going to pin that into place, and then we'll come along and we can sew from the right side, edge stitching just close to this edge all the way around. Alright, and here's what it looks like when it's finished. This is the outside, and that's the inside. So on the inside, it doesn't matter as much if the stitching is uneven, because we top stitched, edge stitched from the outside. The stitching is nice and even. I was hoping this wasn't going to happen, but some of my old stitching is showing through in some places, like there. So I'm just gonna, can you see that? I'm just gonna go through and unpick the part that is showing, because I just want this nice edge stitching to still be showing, not the one on the yellow fabric. Another little tip real fast is if you're sewing with a fabric that has multiple colors in it, like I am, my green thread matches my background, but it doesn't match the yellow or the yellow and white places. So I started and stopped in a green spot so that it would hide the stitching better. If I had started and stopped in a yellow spot, the start-stop place would be more visible. So, all right, that's the other way to put on the band.